Chapter 2, The Last of a Long Line, by Charles Dickens. Sir Roger Rockville of Rockville was the last of a very long line. It extended from the Norman conquest to the present century. His first known ancestor came over with William, and must have been a man of some mark, either of bone and sinew, or of brain, for he obtained what the Americans would call a prime location. As his name does not occur in the roll of Battle Abbey, he was, of course, not of a very high Norman extraction. But he had done enough, it seems, in the way of knocking down Saxons, to place himself on a considerable eminence in this kingdom. The center of his domains was conspicuous far over the country, through a high range of rock overhanging one of the sweetest rivers in England. On one hand lay a vast tract of rich marshland, capable, as society advanced, of being converted into meadows, and on the other as extensive moorlands, finely undulating, and abounding with woods and deer. Here the original Sir Roger built his castle on the summit of the range of rock, with huts for his followers, and became known directly all over the country of Sir Roger de Rockville, or Sir Roger of the hamlet on the rock. Sir Roger, no doubt, was a mighty hunter before the lord of the feudal district. It is certain that his descendants were. For generations, they led a jolly life at Rockville, and were always ready to exchange the excitement of the chase for a bit of the Civil War. Without that the country would have grown dull, and ale and venison lost their flavor. There was no gay London in those days, and a good brisk skirmish with their neighbors in helm and hauberk was the way of spending their season. It was their parliamentary debate, and was necessary to stir their blood. Protection and free trade were as much the great topics of interest as they are now, only they did not trouble themselves so much about corn bills. Their bills were of good steel, and their protective measures were arrows a cloth-yard long. Protection meant a good suit of mail, and a castle with its duly prescribed moats, bastions, portcullises, and donjon keep. Free trade was a lively inroad into the neighboring barons' lands, and the importation thence of goodly herds and flocks. Foreign cattle for home consumption was as striking an article in their markets as in ours, only the blows were expended on one another's heads, instead of the heads of foreign bullocks. That is, bullocks from over the Welsh or Scotch marches, as from beyond the next brook. Thus lived the Rockvilles for ages. In all the iron combats of those iron times they took care to have their quota, whether it was Stephen against Matilda, or Richard against his father, or John against the barons, whether it were York or Lancaster, or Tudor or Stuart. The Rockvilles were to be found in the mêlée and winning power and lands. So long as it required only stalwart frames and stout blows, no family cut a more conspicuous figure. The Rockvilles were at Bosworth Field. The Rockvilles fought in Ireland under Elizabeth. The Rockvilles were staunch defenders of the cause in the War of Charles I with his parliament. The Rockvilles even fought for James Roman II. At the Boyne, when three-fourths of the most loyal of the English nobility and gentry had deserted him in disgust and indignation, but from that hour they had been less conspicuous. The opposition to the successful party, that of William of Orange, of course brought them into disgrace, and though they were never molested on that account, they retired to their estate and found it convenient to be as unobtrusive as possible. Thenceforward you heard no more of the Rockvilles in the national annals. They became only of consequence in their own district. They acted as magistrates. They served as high sheriffs. They were a substantial county family, and nothing more. Education and civilization advanced. A wider and very different field of action and ambition opened upon the aristocracy of England. Our fleets and armies abroad, our legislature at home, law and the church, presented brilliant paths to the ambition of those thirsting for distinction, and the good things that follow it. But somehow the Rockvilles did not expand with this expansion. So long as it required only a figure of 6 feet high, broad shoulders, and a strong arm, they were a great and conspicuous race. But when the head became the member most in request, they ceased to go ahead. Younger sons, it is true, served in army and in navy and filled the family pulpit, but they produced no generals, no admirals, no archbishops. The Rockvilles of Rockville were very conservative, very exclusive, and very stereotype. Other families grew poor, and enriched themselves again by marrying plebeian heiresses. New families grew up out of plebeian blood into greatness, and intermingled the vigor of their fresh earth with the attenuated aristocratic soil. Men of family became great lawyers, great statesmen, great prelates, and even great poets and philosophers. The Rockvilles remained high, proud, bigoted, and borné. The Rockvilles married Rockvilles, or their first cousins, the Craigvilles, simply to prevent property going out of the family. They kept the property together. They did not lose an acre, and they were a fine, tall, solemn race, and nothing more. What ailed them? If you saw Sir Roger Rockville, for there was an eternal Sir Roger, filling his office of High Sheriff, He had a very fine carriage, and a very fine retinue in the most approved and splendid of antique costumes. If you saw him sitting on the bench at quarter sessions, he was a tall, stately, and solemn man. If you saw Lady Rockville shopping in her handsome carriage with very handsomely attired servants, saw her at the county ball or on the race stand, she was a tall, aristocratic, and stately lady. That was in the last generation. The present could boast of no Lady Rockville. Great outward respect was shown to the Rockvilles on account of the length of their descent and the breadth of their acres. They were always, when any stranger asked about them, declared, with a serious and important air, to be a very ancient, honorable, and substantial family. Oh, a great family are the Rockvilles, a very great family. But if you came to close quarters with the members of this great and highly distinguished family, you soon found yourself fundamentally astonished. You had a sensation come over you, as if you were trying, like Moses, to draw water from a rock without his delegated power. There was a goodly outside of things before you, but nothing came of it. You talked, hoping to get talking in return, but you got little more than no's and yesies and oh, indeeds, and reallys, and sometimes not even that, but a certain look of aristocratic dignity or dignification that was meant to serve for all answers. There was a sort of resting on aristocratic oars or skulls that were not to be too vulgarly handled. There was a feeling impressed on you that 800 years of descent and 10,000 a year in landed income did not trouble themselves with the trifling things that gave distinction to lesser people, such as literature, fine arts, politics, and general knowledge. These were very well for those who had nothing else to pride themselves on, but for the Rockvilles, oh, certainly they were by no means requisite. In fact, you found yourself, with a little variation, in the predicament of Cowper's people. Who hasn't often come across these dry wells of society, solemn gulfs out of which you can pump nothing up? You know them. They are at your elbow every day in large and brilliant companies, and defy the best sucking bucket ever invented to extract anything from them. But the Rockvilles were each and all of this a dust description. It was a family feature, and they seemed, if either, rather proud of it. They must be so, for proud they were, amazing proud, and they had nothing besides to be proud of except their acres and their ancestors. But the fact was, they could not help it. It was become organic. They had acted the justice of peace, maintained the Constitution against upstarts and manufacturers, signed warrants, supported the Church and the House of Correction, committed poachers, and then rested on the dignity of their ancestors for so many generations, that their skulls, brains, constitutions, and nervous systems were all so completely molded into that shape and baked into that mold that a Rockville would be. Rockville to the end of time, if God and nature would have allowed it. But such things wear out. The American Indians and the Australian nations wear out. They are not progressive, and as nature abhors a vacuum, she does not forget the vacuum wherever it may be, whether in a hot desert or in a cold and stately Rockville. A very ancient, honorable, and substantial family that lies fallow till the thinking faculty literally dies out. For several generations, there had been symptoms of decay about the Rockville family. Not in its property, that was as large as ever, not in their personal stature and physical aspect. The Rockvilles continued, as they always had been, a tall and not bad-looking family. But they grew gradually less prolific. For 150 years past, there had seldom been more than 2, or at most 3, children. There had generally been an heir to the estate, and another to the family pulpit, and sometimes a daughter married to some neighboring squire. But Sir Roger's father had been an only child, and Sir Roger himself was an only child. The danger of extinction to the family, apparent as it was, had never induced Sir Roger to marry. At the time that we are turning our attention upon him, he had reached the mature age of 60. Nobody believed that Sir Roger now would marry. He was the last, and likely to be, of his line. It is worth while here to take a glance at Sir Roger and his estate. They bore a strange contrast. The one bore all the signs of progress, the other of a stereotyped feudality. The estate, which in the days of the first Sir Roger de Rockville had been half morass and half wilderness, was now cultivated to the pitch of British agricultural science. The marshlands beyond the river were one splendid expanse of richest meadows, yielding a rental of 4 solid pounds per acre. Over hill and dale on this side for miles, where formerly ran wild deer, and grew wild woodlands or furze bushes, now lay excellent farms and hamlets, and along the ridge of the ancient cliffs rose the most magnificent woods. Woods, too, clothed the steep hillsides, and swept down to the noble river, their very boughs hanging far out over its clear and rapid waters. In the midst of these fine woods stood Rockville Hall, the family seat of the Rockvilles. It reared its old brick walls above the towering mass of elms, and travelers at a distance recognized it for what it was, the mansion of an ancient and wealthy family. The progress of England in arts, science, commerce, and manufacture had carried Sir Roger's estate along with it. It was full of active and moneyed farmers, and flourished under modern influences. How lucky it would have been for the Rockville family had it done the same. But amid this estate there was Sir Roger Solitary, and the last of the line. He had grown well enough, there was nothing stunted about him, so far as you could see on the surface. In stature he exceeded 6 feet. His colossal elms could not boast of a properer relative growth. He was as large a landlord, and as tall a justice of the peace as you could desire. But, unfortunately, he was, after all, only the shell of a man. Like many of his veteran elms, there was a very fine stem, only it was hollow. There was a man, just with the rather awkward deficiency of a soul. And it were no difficult task to explain, either, how this had come about. The Rockvilles saw plainly enough the necessity of manuring their lands, but they scorned the very idea of manuring their family. What? That most ancient, honorable, and substantial family suffer any of the common earth of humanity to gather about its roots. The Rockvilles were so careful of their good blood that they never allied it to any but blood as pure and inane as their own. Their elms flourished in the rotten earth of plebeian accumulations, and their acres produced large crops of corn from the sewage of towns and fat sinks. But the Rockvilles themselves took especial care that no vulgar vigor from the rich heap of ordinary human nature should infuse a new force of intellect into their race. The Rockvilles needed nothing. They had all that an ancient, honorable, and substantial family could need. The Rockvilles had no need to study at school. Why should they? They did not want to get on. The Rockvilles did not aspire to distinction for talent in the world. Why should they? They had a large estate. So the Rockville soul, unused from generation to generation, grew, till it tapered off into nothing. Look at the last of a long line in the midst of his fine estate. Tall he was, with a stoop in his shoulders and a bowing of his head on one side, as if he had been accustomed to stand under the low boughs of his woods and peer after intruders. And that was precisely the fact. His features were thin and sharp, his nose prominent and keen in its character, his eyes small, black, and peering like a mole's or a hungry swine's. Sir Roger was still oracular on the bench, after consulting his clerk, a good lawyer, and looked up to by the neighboring squires in election matters, for he was an unswerving Tory. You never heard of a rational thing that he had said in the whole course of his life. But that mattered little. He was a gentleman of solemn aspect, of stately gait, and of a very ancient family. With 10,000 a year, and his rental rising, he was still, however, a man of overwhelming cares. What mattered a fine estate if all the world was against him? And Sir Roger firmly believed that he stood in that predicament. He had grown up to regard the world as full of little besides upstarts, radicals, manufacturers, and poachers. All were banded, in his belief, against the landed interest. It demanded all the energy of his very small faculties to defend himself and the world against them. Unfortunately for his peace, a large manufacturing town had sprung up within a couple of miles of him. He could see its red brick walls, and its red-tiled roofs, and its tall smoke-vomiting chimneys, growing and extending over the slopes beyond the river. It was to him the most irritating sight in the world. For what were all those swarming weavers and spinners but errant radicals, upstarts, sworn foes of the ancient institutions and the landed interests of England? Sir Roger had passed through many a desperate conflict with them for the return of members to Parliament. They brought forward men that were utter wormwood to all his feelings, and they paid no more respect to him and his friends on such occasions than they did to the meanest creature living. Reverence for ancient blood did not exist in that plebeian and rapidly multiplying tribe. There were master manufacturers there actually that looked and talked as big as himself, and in Trenus, a vast deal more cleverly. The people talked of rights and franchises, and freedom of speech and of conscience, in a way that was really frightful. Then they were given most inveterately to running out in whole and everlasting crowds on Sundays and holidays into the fields and woods. And as there was no part of the neighborhood half so pleasant as the groves and river banks of Rockville, they came swarming up there in crowds that were enough to drive any man of acres frantic. Unluckily, there were roads all about Rockville, foot roads and high roads and bridle roads. There was a road up the riverside, all the way to Rockville Woods, and when it reached them, it divided like a fork, and one prong or footpath led straight up a magnificent grove of a mile long, ending close to the hall. and another ran all along the riverside, under the hills and branches of the wood. Oh, delicious were these woods. In the river there were islands, which were covered in summer with the greenest grass and the freshest of willows, and the clear waters rushed around them in the most inviting manner imaginable. And there were numbers of people extremely ready to accept this delectable invitation of these waters. There they came in fine weather, and as these islands were only separated from the mainland by a little and very shallow stream, it was delightful for lovers to get across, with laughter, and treading on stepping stones, and slipping off the stepping stones up to the ankles into the cool brook, and pretty screams and fresh laughter, and then landing on those sunny, and to them really enchanted, islands. And then came fishermen, solitary fishermen, and fishermen in rows. Fishermen lying in the flowery grass, with fragrant meadowsweet and honey-breathing clover all about their ears, and fishermen standing in file, as if they were determined to clear all the river of fish in one day. And there were other lovers, and troops of loiterers and shouting roisterers, going along under the boughs of the wood, and following the turns of that most companionable of rivers. And there were boats going up and down, boats full of young people, all holiday finery and mirth, and boats with duck hunters and other, to Sir Roger detestable marauders, with guns and dogs and great bottles of beer. In the fine grove on summer days there might be found hundreds of people. There were picnic parties, fathers and mothers with whole families of children, and a grand promenade of the delighted artisans and their wives or sweethearts. In the times prior to the sudden growth of the neighboring town, Great Stockington, and to the simultaneous development of the love of nature principle in the Stockingtonians, nothing had been thought of all these roads. The roads were well enough till they led to these inroads. Then Sir Roger aroused himself. This must be changed. The roads must be stopped. Nothing was easier to his fancy. His fellow justices, Sir Benjamin Bullockshed and Squire Sheepshank, had asked his aid to stop the like nuisances, and it had been done at once. So Sir Roger put up notices all about, that the roads were to be stopped by an order of session, and these notices were signed, as required by law, by their worships of Bullockshed and Sheepshank. But Sir Roger soon found that it was one thing to stop a road leading from one man-town to Lonely Lodge, and another to attempt to stop those from Great Stockington to Rockville. On the very first Sunday after the exhibition of those notice boards, there was a ferment in the grove of Rockville, as if all the bees in the county were swarming there, with all the wasps and hornets to boot. Great crowds were collected before each of these obnoxious placards, and the amount of curses vomited forth against them was really shocking for any day, but more especially for a Sunday. Presently there was a rush at them. They were torn down and simultaneously pitched into the river. There were great crowds swarming all about Rockville all that day, and with looks so defiant that Sir Roger more than once contemplated sending off for the yeoman cavalry to defend his house, which he seriously thought in danger. But so far from being intimidated from proceeding, this demonstration only made Sir Roger the more determined. To have so desperate and irreverent a population coming about his house and woods now presented itself in a much more formidable aspect than ever. So, next day, not only were the placards once more hoisted, but rewards offered for the discovery of the offenders, attended with all the maledictions of the insulted majesty of the law. No notice was taken of this, but the whole of Great Stockington was in a buzz and an agitation. There were posters plastered all over the walls of the town, 4 times as large as Sir Roger's notices, in this style. Englishmen, your dearest rights are menaced. The woods of Rockville, your ancient, rightful, and enchanting resorts, are to be closed to you. Stockingtonians, the eyes of the world are upon you. Awake, arise, or be forever fallen. England expects every man to do his duty, and your duty is to resist and defy the grasping soil lords to seize on your ancient patrimony. Patrimony, ancient and rightful resort of Rockville. Sir Roger was astounded at the audacity of this upstart, plebeian race. What? They actually claimed Rockville, the heritage of 100 successive Rockvilles, as their own. Sir Roger determined to carry it to the sessions, and at the sessions was a magnificent muster of all his friends. There was Sir Roger himself in the chair, and on either hand a prodigious row of county squirearchy. There was Sir Benjamin Bullockshed and Sir Thomas Tenterhook and all the squires, Sheepshank, Ramsbottom, Turnbull, Otterbrook, and Swagsides. The clerk of the session read the notice for the closing of all the footpaths through the woods of Rockville, and declared that this notice had been duly, and for the required period, publicly posted. The Stockingtonians protested by their able lawyer Dairdville against any order for the closing of these ancient woods, the inestimable property of the public. Property of the public, exclaimed Sir Roger. Property of the public, echoed the multitudinous voices of indignant bullock-sheds, tenterhooks, and ramsbottoms. Why, sir, do you dispute the right of Sir Roger Rockville to his own estate? By no means, replied the undaunted Daredevil. The estate of Rockville is unquestionably the property of the Honorable Baronet, Sir Roger Rockville, but the roads through it are the as unquestionable property of the public. The whole bench looked at itself, that is, at each other in wrathful astonishment. The swelling in the diaphragms of the squires Otterbrook, Turnbull, and Swagsides, and all the rest of the worshipful row, was too big to admit of utterance. Only Sir Roger himself burst forth with an abrupt, impudent fellows, but I'll see them first. Grant the order, said Sir Benjamin Bullockshed, and the whole bench nodded assent. The able lawyer Daredevil retired with a pleasant smile. He saw an agreeable prospect of plenty of grist to his mill. Sir Roger was rich, and so was great Stockington. He rubbed his hands, not in the least like a man defeated, and thought to himself, let them go at it, all right. The next day the placards on the Rockville estate were changed for others bearing, stopped by order of sessions. And alongside of them were huge, carefully painted boards, denouncing on all trespassers prosecutions according to law. The same evening came a prodigious invasion of Stockingtonians, tore all the boards and placards down, and carried them on their shoulders to Great Stockington, singing as they went, "See, the conquering heroes come." They set them up in the center of the Stockington marketplace and burnt them, along with an effigy of Sir Roger Rockville. That was grist at once to the mill of the able lawyer Daredevil. He looked on and rubbed his hands. Warrants were speedily issued by the baronets of Bullockshed and Tenterhook for the apprehension of the individuals who had been seen carrying off the notice boards, for larceny, and against a number of others for trespass. There was plenty of work for Daredevil and his brethren of the robe, but it all ended, after the flying about of sundry mandamuses and assize trials, in Sir Roger finding that though Rockville was his, the roads through it were the public's. As Sir Roger drove homeward from the assize, which finally settled the question of these footpaths, he heard the bells in all the steeples of Great Stockington burst forth with a grand peal of triumph. He closed fast the windows of his fine old carriage and sunk into a corner, but he could not drown the intolerable sound. But, said he, I'll stop their picnicking, I'll stop their fishing, I'll have hold of them for trespassing and poaching. There was war henceforth between Rockville and Great Stockington. On the very next Sunday there came literally thousands of the jubilant Stockingtonians to Rockville. They had brought baskets and were for dining and drinking success to all footpaths. But in the great grove there were keepers and watchers who warned them to keep the path, that narrow, well-worn line up the middle of the grove. What, were they not to sit on the grass? No. What, were they not to picnic? No. Not there. The Stockingtonians felt a sudden damp on their spirits, but the river bank, the cry was, to the river bank, there they would picnic. The crowd rushed away down the wood, but on the river bank they found a whole regiment of watchers, who pointed again to the narrow line of footpath and told them not to trespass beyond it. But the islands? They went over to the islands. But there too were Sir Roger's forces, who warned them back. There was no road there, all found there would be trespassers, and be duly punished. The Stockingtonians discovered that their triumph was not quite so complete as they had flattered themselves. The footpaths were theirs, but that was all. Their ancient license was at an end. If they came there was no more fishing. If they came in crowds, there was no more picnicking. If they walked through the woods in numbers, they must keep to Indian file, or they were summoned before the county magistrates for trespass, and were soundly fined, and not even the able Daredevil would undertake to defend them. The Stockingtonians were chop-fallen, but they were angry and dogged, and they thronged up to the village and the front of the hall. They filled the little inn in the hamlet. They went by scores, and roving all over the churchyard, read epitaphs. But don't teach them to give up their old indulgences very good-humoredly. They went and sat in rows on the old churchyard wall, opposite to the very windows of the irate Sir Roger. They felt themselves beaten, and Sir Roger felt himself beaten. True, he could coerce them to the keeping of the footpaths, but then they had the footpaths. True, thought the Stockingtonians, we have the footpaths, but then the picnicking and the fishing and the islands. The Stockingtonians were full of sullen wrath, and Sir Roger was, oh, most expressive old Saxon phrase, hairsore. Yes, he was one universal wound of vexation and jealousy of his rights. Every hair in his body was like a pin sticking into him. Come within a dozen yards of him, nay, at the most, blow on him, and he was excruciated. You rubbed his sensitive hairs at a furlong's distance. The next Sunday the people found the churchyard locked up, except during service when beadles walked there, and desired them not to loiter and disturb the congregation, closing the gates and showing them out like a flock of sheep the moment the service was over. This was fuel to the already boiling blood of Stockington. The week following, what was their astonishment to find the much frequented inn gone? It was actually gone. Not a trace of it, but the spot where it had stood for ages, turfed, planted with young spruce trees, and fenced off with post and rail. The exasperated people now launched forth an immensity of fulminations against the churl Sir Roger, and a certain number of them resolved to come and seat themselves in the street of the hamlet in their dine. But a terrific thunderstorm, which seemed in league with Sir Roger, soon rooted them, drenched them through, and on attempting to seek shelter in the cottages, the poor people said they were very sorry, but it was as much as their holdings were worth, and they dare not admit them. Sir Roger had triumphed. It was all over with the old delightful days at Rockville. There was an end of picnicking, of fishing, and of roving in the islands. One sturdy disciple of Izaak Walton, indeed, dared to fling a line from the banks of Rockville Grove, but Sir Roger came upon him and endeavored to seize him. The man coolly walked into the middle of the river, and, without a word, continued his fishing. "Get out there," exclaimed Sir Roger, "that is still on my property." The man walked through the river to the other bank, where he knew that the land was rented by a farmer. "Give over," shouted Sir Roger, "I tell you the water is mine." "Then," said the fellow, "bottle it up and be hanged to you. Don't you see it is running away to Stockington?" There was bad blood between Rockville and Stockington forever. Stockington was incensed, and Sir Roger was hairsore. A new nuisance sprung up. The people of Stockington looked on the cottagers of Rockville as sunk in deepest darkness under such a man as Sir Roger and his cousin the vicar. They could not picnic, but they thought they could hold a camp meeting. They could not fish for roach, but they thought they might for soles. Accordingly, there assembled crowds of Stockingtonians on the green of Rockville, with a chair and a table, and a preacher with his head bound in a red handkerchief. And soon there was a sound of hymns, and a zealous call to come out of the darkness of the spiritual Babylon. But this was more than Sir Roger could bear. He rushed forth with all his servants, keepers, and cottagers, overthrew the table, and routing the assembly, chased them to the boundary of his estate. The discomfited Stockingtonians now fulminated awful judgments on the unhappy Sir Roger, as a persecutor and a malignant. They dared not enter again on his parish, but they came to the very verge of it, and held weekly meetings on the highway, in which they sang and declaimed as loudly as possible, that the winds might bear their voices to Sir Roger's ears. To such a position was now reduced the last of the long line of Rockville. The spirit of a policeman had taken possession of him. He had keepers and watchers out on all sides, but that did not satisfy him. He was perpetually haunted with the idea that poachers were after his game, that trespassers were in his woods. His whole life was now spent in stealing to and fro in his fields and plantations, and prowling along his river side. He lurked under hedges and watched for long hours under the forest trees. If anyone had a curiosity to see Sir Roger, they had only to enter his fields by the woodside and wander a few yards from the path, and he was almost sure to spring out over the hedge, and in angry tones demand their name and address. The descendant of the chivalrous and steel-clad de Rockvilles was sunk into a restless spy on his own ample property. There was but one idea in his mind: encroachment. It was destitute of all other furniture, but the musty technicalities of warrants and commitments. There was a stealthy and skulking manner in everything that he did. He went to church on Sundays, but it was no longer by the grand iron gate opposite to his house, that stood generally with a large spider's web woven over the lock, and several others in different corners of the fine iron tracery, bearing evidence of the long period since it had been opened. How different to the time when the Sir Roger and Lady of Rockville had had these gates thrown wide on a Sunday morning, and, with all their train of household servants at their back, with true antique dignity, marched with much proud humility into the house of God. Now Sir Roger, the solitary, suspicious, undignified Sir Roger, the keeper and policeman of his own property, stole in at a little side gate from his paddock, and back the same way, wondering all the time whether there was not somebody in his pheasant preserves or Sunday trespassers in his grove. If you entered his house, it gave you as cheerless a feeling as its owner. There was the conservatory, so splendid with rich plants and flowers in his mother's time, now a dusty receptacle of hampers, broken hand glasses, and garden tools. These tools could never be used, for the gardens were grown wild. Tall grass grew in the walks, and the huge unpruned shrubs disputed the passage with you. In the wood above the gardens, reached by several flights of fine, but now moss-grown, steps, there stood a pavilion once clearly very beautiful. It was now damp and ruinous, its walls covered with greenness and crawling insects. It was a great lurking place of Sir Roger when on the watch for poachers. The line of the Rockvilles was evidently running fast out. It had reached the extremity of imbecility and contempt. It must soon reach its close. Sir Roger used to make his regular annual visit to town, but of late, when there, he had wandered restlessly about the streets, peeping into the shop windows, and if it rained, standing under entries for hours together till it was gone over. The habit of lurking and peering about was upon him, and his feet bore him instinctively into those narrow and crowded alleys where swarm the poachers of the city, the trespassers and anglers in the game preserves and streams of humanity. He had lost all pleasures in his club. The most exciting themes of political life retained no piquancy for him. His old friends ceased to find any pleasure in him. He was become the driest of all dry wells. Poachers and anglers and Methodists haunted the wretched purlieus of his fast fading out mind, and he resolved to go to town no more. His whole nature was centered in his woods. He was forever on the watch, and when at Rockville again, if he heard a door clap when in bed, he thought it a gun in his woods and started up and was out with his keepers. Of what value was that magnificent estate to him, those superb woods, those finely hanging cliffs, that clear and riant river coming traveling on, and taking a noble sweep below his windows, that glorious expanse of neat verdant meadows stretching almost to Stockington, and enlivened by numerous herds of the most beautiful cattle, those old farms and shady lanes overhung with hazel and wild rose, the glittering brook and the songs of woodland birds. What were they to that worn-out old man, that victim of the delusive doctrine of blood, of the man-trap of an hereditary name? There the poet could come, and feel the presence of divinity in that noble scene, and hear sublime whispers in the trees, and create new heavens and earths from the glorious chaos of nature around him, and in one short hour live an empyrean of celestial life and love. There could come the very humblest children of the plebeian town, and feel a throb of exquisite delight pervade their bosoms at the sight of the very flowers on the sod, and see heaven in the infinite blue above them. And poor Sir Roger, the holder but not the possessor of all, walked only in a region of sterility, with no sublimer ideas than poachers and trespassers, no more rational enjoyment than the brute indulgence of hunting like a ferret and seizing his fellow men like a bulldog. He was a specimen of human nature degenerated, retrograded from the divine to the bestial, through the long operating influences of false notions and institutions, continued beyond their time. He had only the soul of a keeper. Had he been only a keeper, he had been a much happier man. His time was at hand. The severity which he had long dealt out towards all sorts of offenders made him the object of the deepest vengeance. In a lonely hollow of his woods, watching at midnight with two of his men, there came a sturdy knot of poachers. An affray ensued. The men perceived that their old enemy, Sir Roger, was there, and the blow of a hedge stake stretched him on the earth. His keepers fled, and thus ignominiously terminated the long line of the Rockvilles. Sir Roger was the last of his line, but not of his class. There is a feudal art of sinking, which requires no study, and the Rockvilles are but one family among thousands who have perished in its practice. In Great Stockington there lived a race of paupers. From the year of the 42D of Elizabeth, or 1601, down to the present generation, this race maintained an uninterrupted descent. They were a steady and unbroken line of paupers, as the parish books testify. From generation to generation, their demands on the parish funds stand recorded. There were no lack an in their career. There never failed an heir to these families. Fed on the bread of idleness and legal provision, these people nourished, increased, and multiplied. Sometimes compelled to work for the weekly dole which they received, they never acquired a taste for labor, or lost the taste for the bread for which they did not labor. These paupers regarded this maintenance by no means as a disgrace. They claimed it as a right, as their patrimony. They contended that 1/3 of the property of the church had been given by benevolent individuals for the support of the poor, and that what the Reformation wrongfully deprived them of, the great enactment of Elizabeth rightfully, and only rightfully, restored. Those who imagine that all paupers merely claimed parish relief because the law ordained it, commit a great error. There were numbers who were hereditary paupers, and that on a tradition carefully handed down, that they were only manfully claiming their own. They traced their claims from the most ancient feudal times, when the lord was as much bound to maintain his villein in gross, as the villein was to work for the lord. These paupers were, in fact, or claimed to be, the original adscripti gleb a, and to have as much a claim to parish support as the landed proprietor had to his land. For this reason, in the old Catholic times, after they had escaped from villanage by running away and remaining absent from their hundred for a year and a day, dwelling for that period in a walled town, These people were among the most diligent attendants at the abbey doors, and when the abbeys were dissolved, were, no doubt, among the most daring of these thieves, vagabonds, and sturdy rogues, who, after the Robin Hood fashion, beset the highways and solitary farms of England, and claimed their black mail in a very unceremonious style. It was out of this class that Henry Roman VIII hanged his 72,000 during his reign, and, as it is said, without appearing materially to diminish their number. That they continued to increase, multiply, and replenish the earth, overflowing all bounds, overpowering by mere populousness all the severe laws against them of whipping, burning in the hand, in the forehead, or the breast, and hanging, and filling the whole country with alarm, is evident by the very act itself of Elizabeth. Among these hereditary paupers who, as we have said, were found in Stockington, there was a family of the name of Degg. This family had never failed to demand and enjoy what it held to be its share of its ancient inheritance. It appeared from the parish records that they had practiced in different periods the crafts of shoemaking, tailoring, and chimney sweeping. But since the invention of the stocking frame, they had, one and all of them, followed the profession of stocking weavers, or as they were there called, stockingers. This was a trade which required no extreme exertion of the physical or intellectual powers. To sit in a frame and throw the arms to and fro was a thing that might either be carried to a degree of extreme diligence or be let down into a mere apology for idleness. An idle stockinger was there no very uncommon phrase, and the Deggs were always classed under that head. Nothing could be more admirably adapted than this trade for building a plan of parish relief upon. The Deggs did not pretend to be absolutely without work, or the parish authorities would soon have set them to some real labor, a thing that they particularly recoiled from, having a very old adage in the family that hard work was enough to kill a man. The Deggs were seldom, therefore, out of work, but they did not get enough to meat and tie. They had but little work if times were bad, and if they were good, they had large families and sickly wives or children. Be times what they would, therefore, the Deggs were due and successful attendants at the parish pay table. Nay, so much was this a matter of course, that they came at length not even to trouble themselves to receive their pay, but sent their young children for it, and it was duly paid. Did any parish officer, indeed, turn restive and decline to pay a Degg, he soon found himself summoned before a magistrate, and such pleas of sickness, want of work, and poor earnings brought up, that he most likely got a sharp rebuke from the benevolent but uninquiring magistrate, and acquired a character for hard-heartedness that stuck to him. So parish overseers learned to let the Deggs alone, and their children, regularly brought up to receive the parish money for their parents, were impatient as they grew up to receive it for themselves. Marriages in the Degg family were consequently very early, and there were plenty of instances of married Deggs claiming parish relief under the age of 20, on the plea of being the parent of 2 children. One such precocious individual being asked by a rather verdant officer why he had married before he was able to maintain a family, replied, in much astonishment, that he had married in order to maintain himself by parish assistance, that he never had been able to maintain himself by his labor, nor ever expected to do it. His only hope, therefore, lay in marrying and becoming the father of 2 children, to which patriarchal rank he had now attained, and demanded his pay. Thus had lived and flourished the Deggs on their ancient patrimony, the parish, for upwards of 200 years. Nay, we have no doubt whatever that, if it could have been traced, they had enjoyed an ancestry of paupers as long as the pedigree of Sir Roger Rockville himself. In the days of the most perfect villanage, they had, doubtless, eaten the bread of idleness and claimed it as a right. They were numerous, improvident, ragged in dress, and fond of an alehouse and of gossip. Like the blood of Sir Roger, their blood had become peculiar through a long persistence of the same circumstances. It was become pure pauper blood. The Deggs married, if not entirely among Deggs, yet among the same class. None but a pauper would dream of marrying a Degg. The Deggs, therefore, were in constitution, in mind, in habit, and in inclination, paupers. But a pure and unmixed class of this kind does not die out like an aristocratic stereotype. It increases and multiplies. The lower the grade, the more prolific, as is sometimes seen on a large and even national scale. The Deggs threatened, therefore, to become a most formidable clan in the lower purlieus of Stockington, but luckily there is so much virtue even in evils, that one, not rarely, cures another. War, the great evil, cleared the town of Deggs. Fond of idleness, of indulgence, of money easily got, and as easily spent, the Deggs were rapidly drained off by recruiting parties during the last war. The young men enlisted and were marched away. The young women married soldiers that were quartered in the town from time to time and marched away with them. There were, eventually, None of the once numerous Deggs left except a few old people, whom death was sure to draft off at no distant period with his regiment of the line which has no end. Parish overseers, magistrates, and master manufacturers felicitated themselves at this unhoped-for deliverance from the ancient family of the Deggs. But one cold, clear winter evening, the east wind piping its sharp sibilant ditty in the bare-shorn hedges, and poking his sharp fingers into the sides of well-broad-clothed men by way of passing jest, Mr. Spires, a great manufacturer of Stockington, driving in his gig some 7 miles from the town, passed a poor woman with a stout child on her back. The large, ruddy-looking man in the prime of life, and in the greatcoat and thick-waisted gloves of a wealthy traveler, cast a glance at the wretched creature trudging heavily on, expecting a pitiful appeal to his sensibilities, and thinking it a bore to have to pull off a glove and dive into his pocket for a copper. But to his surprise there was no demand, only a low curtsy, and the glimpse of a face of singular honesty of expression and of excessive weariness. Spires was a man of warm feelings. He looked earnestly at the woman and thought he had never seen such a picture of fatigue in his life. He pulled up and said, "You seem very tired, my good woman." "Awfully tired, sir." "And are you going far tonight?" "To Great Stockington, sir, if God give me strength." "To Stockington," exclaimed Mr. Spires. "Why, you seem ready to drop." "You'll never reach it, you'd better stop at the next village." "Aye, sir, it's easy stopping for those that have money." "And you've none, eh?" "As God lives, sir, I've a sixpence and that's all." Mr. Spires put his hand in his pocket and held out to her the next instant half-a-crown. "There, stop, poor thing, make yourself comfortable, it's quite out of the question to reach Stockington. But stay, are your friends living in Stockington? What are you?" "A poor soldier's widow, sir, and may God Almighty bless you," said the poor woman, taking the money, the tears standing in her large brown eyes as she curtsied very low. "A soldier's widow," said Mr. Spires. She had touched the softest place in the manufacturer's heart, for he was a very loyal man and vehement champion of his country's honor in the war. "So young," said he, "how did you lose your husband?" "He fell, sir," said the poor woman, but she could get no further. She suddenly caught up the corner of her gray cloak, covered her face with it, and burst into an excess of grief. The manufacturer felt as if he had hit the woman a blow by his careless question. He sat watching her for a moment in silence, and then said, "Come, get into the gig, my poor woman. Come, I must see you to Stockington." The poor woman dried her tears and heavily climbed into the gig, expressing her gratitude in a very touching and modest manner. Spires buttoned the apron over her, and taking a look at the child, said in a cheerful tone to comfort her, "Bless me, but that is a fine thumping fellow, though. I don't wonder you are tired, carrying such a load." The poor woman pressed the stout child, apparently 2 years old, to her breast, as if she felt it a great blessing and no load. The gig drove rapidly on. Presently Mr. Spires resumed his conversation. "So you are from Stockington?" "No, sir, my husband was." "So, what was his name?" "John Degg, sir." "Degg?" said Mr. Spires. "Degg, did you say?" "Yes, sir." The manufacturer seemed to hitch himself off towards his own side of the gig, gave another look at her, and was silent. The poor woman was somewhat astonished at his look and movement, and was silent too. After a while Mr. Spires said again, "And do you hope to find friends in Stockington? Had you none where you came from?" "None, sir, none in the world," said the poor woman, and again her feelings seemed too strong for her. At length she added, "I was in service, sir, at Poole in Dorsetshire when I married. My mother only was living, and while I was away with my husband she died. When the news came from abroad that, when I was a widow, sir, I went back to my native place, and the parish officers said I must go to my husband's parish, lest I and my child should become troublesome." "You asked relief of them?" "Never, oh, God knows, never. My family have never asked a penny of a parish. They would die first, and so would I, sir, but they said I might do it, and I had better go to my husband's parish at once, and they offered me money to go." "And you took it, of course?" "No, sir, I had a little money, which I had earned by washing and laundering, and I sold most of my things as I could not carry them and came off. I felt hurt, sir. My heart rose against the treatment of the parish, and I thought I should be better among my husband's friends, and my child would, if anything happened to me. I had no friends of my own." Mr. Spires looked at the woman in silence. Did your husband tell you anything of his friends? What sort of a man was he? Oh, he was a gay young fellow, rather, sir, but not bad to me. He always said his friends were well off in Stockington. He did, said the manufacturer, with a great stare, and as if bolting the words from his heart in a large gust of wonder. The poor woman again looked at him with a strange look. The manufacturer whistled to himself, and giving his horse a smart cut with the whip, drove on faster than ever. The night was fast settling down. It was numbing cold. A gray fog rose from the river as they thundered over the old bridge, and tall engine chimneys and black smoky houses loomed through the dusk before them. They were at Stockington. As they slackened their pace up a hill at the entrance of the town, Mr.